Great. Well, feel free to keep introducing yourselves in the chat. Thank you for joining our session today on reimagining how we make school spending decisions. Our goal today is to talk about how transparent data and equitable community engagement practices can create a seat at the table for a broad range of stakeholders to engage on these critical funding decisions. So given that this is our agenda for today, we'll start with the data and why it matters and how states have reported this school level spending data. We'll also talk about how we as advocates can help improve how these data are reported, and then the opportunities for how we can use this information. We have a lot of content to go through today, so feel free to drop your questions in the chat and we'll make sure to answer them. With that, I will pass the mic to my colleague.
Thanks, Rachel. Hi, everyone. I'm Ivy Morgan. I'm the Associate Director for Analytics on the P12 Policy team at EdTrust, and I'm excited to talk to you guys about my favorite topic here, which is school funding data. So why are we here, right? Why do we care about school funding data? Why do we care about how states have reported that data? Well, for a really long time, we've had data that pretty clearly tell us about inequities in funding between districts with varying levels of resources. So on the slide here, right, we've got data that tells us that the highest poverty districts in Missouri spend about almost $1,000 less per student than the lowest poverty districts in Missouri. We've had very clear data that tell us that for a while. What has been less clear are the funding inequities that exist between schools in the same district. So, we've had questions like this for as long as schools have been operating, but we just haven't known that much about the inequities in funding between schools within districts. We had some data that suggests that there are inequities, but it was not widely available, right? So we didn't know in all districts across all states. And so we really had to rely on anecdotal evidence. Now that we do have school level data, because of the ESSA requirement that I'll briefly cover in a second, we can see patterns like this that we see in Hartford, Connecticut, that spending across the schools doesn't vary that much based on the poverty level across schools in a district. The ESSA requirement, the ESSA fiscal transparency requirement that was passed in 2015 really created the space for us to see data to have data to understand patterns like this. Specifically, that requirement says that state and district report cards have to include per pupil expenditure data. It's got to be broken out by source of funds, so whether it's federal sources or state and local sources. The data that go on report cards has to include actual personnel and non-personnel expenditures, not averages across the district or anything like that. And the data have to be reported for each school in the district and the district as a whole. But this is actually a pretty bare bones requirement. So we think it's really important to advocate for going beyond those requirements. And just to make this a little bit more concrete, I want to hear a little bit from you. So imagine that you're working with your school district and you'd like to see where to target new federal funds. What additional information would you want beyond what's on the screen here to inform your advocacy, right? So for every single school, imagine that you knew the total school funding per student, the amount that was from federal sources, and the amount that was from state sources. What additional information would you want to help inform your advocacy? And you can just go ahead and select the response that corresponds to your choice on the screen. So Is it option A, that you've got everything you need? Is it option B, that you'd like to see some student demographic information, like the percentage of students from low-income backgrounds or the percentage of English learners? Is it option C, that you'd like to see additional information on access to key resources, like the percentage of non-novice teachers in the schools, or the extent to which students have access to advanced courses? Or would you like to see state or district spending averages? Or would you like to see all of the above, like I see some folks putting in the chat? Yeah, totally agree. I'd like to see all of them, that's for sure. Yeah, and so it looks like lots of folks would definitely like to see additional student demographic information. Some folks would like to see information on access to key resources. There's some interest in state and district averages. I think that's right. All of them are important. That is absolutely right. But the point that I really want to make here is that no one said A, right? No one said that they had all of the information that they need. We think all of these resources are important, and that's why it is so important for states to go beyond ESSA compliance when they're reporting the data. And I just want to take a quick note to say that we'll be talking about school spending data a lot during this session, but really this is more this is about more than numbers on a page, right? The school spending data help us understand in a little bit more detail other non-financial resources that are available in schools, like access to educators who have experience, information on the extent to which students have you know science labs in their schools, or access to the other resources, access to computers and technology labs, things like that. So money buys all of these things, right? It's not just about the dollars for the dollar's sake. It's about the ability of the dollars to provide these additional resources to enrich students' experiences in classrooms. And I think that the large influx of COVID relief funding has put a really fine focus on where dollars are going right now. And this reporting requirement just makes it so much more, important that states get this right, that they report the information that we need to really understand what kinds of spending decisions are being made or should be made. With that, I will turn it back over to Rachel to talk about a report that we just released that talks about this in a lot more depth.
Great. Thank you, Ivy. And to your point, whether or not these data provide the insight that parents, advocates, community members, and district leaders need to assess school funding equity really depends on how states have reported these data. And so, in order to provide guidance about how these data can be more equity oriented, we developed 5 principles for school spending reporting. All of these principles work together to give stakeholders a comprehensive view of what is being spent at the school level. For example, to make meaning of this data, you need context. You need context about the district, about the school itself, what grades, what size, and also the students that the school serves. In addition, if you as a parent, someone who's logging into these reports, if you want to look at how spending at your child's school compares to another school in your district or state, you need meaningful comparisons right there on the report. So all of these principles highlight the different features and elements that states should be reporting with their financial data. And they all work together and build on each other. So none of these principles work in isolation. Most importantly, these principles are to help any user or stakeholder answer their questions about school funding equity. So answering these questions on the screen If your state is reporting data in a way that doesn't allow you to answer these questions, we urge them to do better. In an equitable school funding system, we would expect to see that there are additional resources and funding being spent in schools that serve higher concentrations of students who are English language learners, who are students who have disabilities, or students who come from low-income backgrounds. And we would expect that the schools are not underinvesting in the district is not underinvesting in schools that serve higher concentrations of students of color. So if you cannot look at your school spending report right now and answer these questions, there's a lot of room for your state to grow in how they report these data. So that's why we released our recent report, Going Beyond ESSA Compliance. This is a 50-state scan that assesses how well states have reported their data and whether or not it aligns to the 5 principles we just described. Our ratings really show they highlight the key features that states could implement and to increase the transparency of their data, but also to increase the likelihood that these data are being used. And so in our report, you see ratings for your state, and we also highlight some bright spots because there are some states that are doing interesting things that other state leaders can learn from and implement. Overall, though, our findings reveal that while states are complying with the ESSA requirement, they are really falling short of making their data available in a way that's complete and useful to the everyday person. We see that comparisons are not as common as we would like, and only 5 states are including those very high leverage visualizations that make the connection between school spending and the student needs. And also we see that only 1 state is really aligned to the equity-oriented principles that we highlight, and that's Illinois. We know that states are going to have other opportunities to improve their data reporting, so we hope they could learn from Illinois' process, which we highlight in our report, to inform their efforts. So to talk us through what advocates can do, I'll leave it to Ivy.
Yeah. So, as Rachel just shared, our 50-state scan shows that the vast majority of states have a long way to go in terms of reporting their school level spending data in a way that is really useful to help understand patterns of equity in school funding across schools within districts. This is a really big missed opportunity. So we wanted to talk in a little bit more detail about what advocates can do to address this. The good news is that there are lots of opportunities. This is definitely something that is in the state's purview to address. And so I'm just going to talk through a few specific examples that we've come up with or that we've seen. So first, you could, share the findings of our analysis in particular and your state-specific rating with your state commissioner of education. In the report that Rachel just talked about, there's a little form on every single state's page where you can enter a little bit of contact information. It generates a letter that you can then send directly to the chief state school officer, the state superintendent in your state. I will note that we had a little technical issue, and so the letter that you see might not be the right letter at the moment, but tomorrow it will be a letter that's about this report that you can send off to your state leaders to encourage them to learn more about the analysis and the findings in the report to get some inspiration for improving the reporting. In particular, we think it's helpful to share information about how state leaders in Illinois did that, right? Like Illinois shows that this can be done. that data can be reported in a way that allows stakeholders to sort of make more meaning of the data. Now, I'm not saying that it's an easy process, that it can be done with a snap of the fingers, right? Illinois took about 2 years to do this, but we've got a pretty clear roadmap in the report that outlines how they got there, that we think is really helpful. Or you can urge leaders in your state to pass legislation requiring transparent data reporting. That's exactly what advocates in Delaware did. They pushed for additional transparency beyond the requirements of ESSA to get the state of Delaware to report super equity-oriented data. Specifically, that law had a few additional requirements around making sure that it was easy to tease out the differences between spending in charter schools and spending in traditional public districts. The work definitely did not stop there. Advocates in Delaware are still very much actively engaged in making sure that the state implements the law, both to the sort of, the letter and the intent, right? It's still an ongoing process. That is another example. Or you can create your own transparent report, and that's exactly what advocates in North Carolina did. They had a bunch of conversations with their state and really realized that their state didn't have the capacity to do this themselves, to take this on themselves. And so BEST and C in North Carolina created a dashboard that allows you to see school level spending data alongside some other measures like the percentage of students from low-income backgrounds in each school, or other like academic outcome measures for schools. We don't think this is a substitute, right, for the state producing good reporting, but it is sort of a helpful, interim step or backstop. And so just to recap one more time, right? States have made the investment to put these data on their report cards, and it was a lot of work. And the information that's out there has helped move the field pretty far in understanding differences in spending across schools within districts. But there's a lot of room. There's a lot of room to grow. And so some specific ways that you guys can advocate for improving this data in your states is to share the findings of our analysis, in particular what Illinois did. There are sort of paths to passing legislation or creating your own tools in the interim.
Great. So, now that we know that these school level spending data exist, they're out there, and we know there's a role for us to play as advocates in encouraging our states to do better and report these data in a more useful way. There is a lot that we can discuss and think about as far as how to use this information, especially now when there's a lot of attention on the American Rescue Plan. Specifically, the requirement that every state and district consults their community in the creation of spending plans. While most states have already created their plan, and districts have either created their plans or they're still working on these spending plans, we know that the work shouldn't just end here. We think that this is a great opportunity for us to see how there is relationship building that's continuous and engagement that's continuous at the local and state level around school spending. And in addition to the American Rescue Plan, there are other opportunities to engage with this information, right? So we can use the school level spending data now to see where we should be targeting our federal funds. And then in another year or so, when these data are reported, we can figure out and assess how well districts and states have actually followed their plans that they wrote out and their commitments to equity. We also know that there are annual budget cycles, at the local level that could really be transformed with the use of school level spending data. And while it's not as widespread as we would hope, this is being done. In Illinois, there is a school district that used school level spending data to see how, whether resources, how they were being allocated across the district. And they were able to dissect the reasons for spending variation, and they shared that with the community. And obviously, this transparency built trust, right? And they had this report that showed their spending patterns and what was driving the variation. And now the Illinois State Board of Education uses this district as a model for others. And so we know that this can be done. We just want to see it happen more often. And lastly, let's not forget the requirement in ESSA for resource allocation reviews. Periodically, localities and states should be looking at how resources are allocated to drive school improvement. And so this is a great opportunity to do that. Great. So with that, I'm really excited for our discussion. We have two special guests today who are going to share more about evidence-based practices for how we can do community engagement, how people can be involved in these school funding decisions. So I'll let them introduce themselves.
Hi, I'll jump in. I'm Christy Tate. I'm the Director of Civic Health Initiatives with the Center for the Future of Arizona, and really excited to be a part of the discussion today. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Isabel Luciano. I work for the Participatory Budgeting Project, and I'm the Director of the People's Fellowship, which is a youth fellowship.
Great. We're so excited to have you. To kick off our conversation today, Isabel, participatory budgeting is often cited as a great strategy for getting community input in funding decisions. Can you walk us through some of those key components in that process and, how you would define participatory budgeting?
Yeah, so the definition we typically like to provide is PB, participatory budgeting, we say PB for short. It's a democratic process where community members work together to decide how to spend part of a public budget. It has certain phases. You start with idea collection. More and more, we're adding this needs assessment phase to idea collection, where we really ask the community what is needed through a series of questions in order to inform solutions. So we collect ideas at the same time as we assess what the needs are. We develop proposals, and then the community votes on those proposals. And so it's not a consultation. And so engagement metrics are important. It brings people closer together. Community members use their lived experience to really decide on real decisions, which in this case would be a budget. And so it's an annual cycle intended to continue. After the ideas are funded and implemented, you start over again. So meaningful consultation can mean a lot of things. And to us at PBP, it looks like, for instance, people making decisions together. If it's in a school setting, it means the school community, including staff, faculty, and students, and administrators, really working together to decide how to use a part of a budget and how to allocate it. And then I would really emphasize using your community members' lived experiences as well as other forms of data to really work together on before you jump to what solutions could work for your needs. I'll also say that you can design your PB process to achieve a lot of things. And so you can have you can work with youth budgets, and you can design a strictly youth process where youth are involved. You can also work with schools and work with school budgets, and you could have a budget for students to decide how to use, for staff, for parents and guardians. So it's very flexible.
Okay. And Isabel, lastly, how do you think this process advances equity?
In so many ways. You can design equity into it. I would say even if you don't design equity into it, by using community members' lived experiences, you provide opportunities to surface information that goes beyond the data. And you wouldn't have those opportunities if community members are not invited into those spaces. And so it often uncovers, for instance, if you're using a school budget at a district level, you might uncover that resources are not felt the same everywhere. But you also provide opportunities for new leaders to emerge and really like contribute to decision making in your community.
Great. So for Christy and Isabel, feel free to jump in afterward. But what, are there schools or districts that are doing this or have done this well? And what's worked in those places? What can we learn from them?
Sure. So I can offer a little perspective on what's happening here in Arizona with school participatory budgeting. I just wanted to start by giving a little context on our Center for the Future of Arizona. We're a nonprofit that's based in Phoenix, but we have this statewide mission of really advancing what we call the Arizona we want. So that's a shared vision of success for the state that we've developed really through this process of listening and deepening our own understanding of shared priorities for action. So this idea of civic voice and civic visioning and then civic engagement to really realize those priorities is core to everything we do. And school participatory budgeting has just been a really powerful tool in Arizona and a powerful strategy to make that possible. So as Isabel described those steps of the process in a school setting, then students are really leading that process. So they're the ones who are identifying the challenges, collecting the ideas, the possible solutions, building out detailed project proposals, and ultimately the full campus is then voting on where are those dollars going to go and where will they be spent. So in Arizona, this process started with Phoenix Union High School District, which is just an amazing leader in this work. They piloted the first ever kind of school-based setting for the PB process, scaled it district-wide, have now made huge investments to use PB as a tool for community decision-making. And then we at the center have been able to learn from that process and bring that to school communities across the state. So we now have about 47 schools this year. Over 60,000 students in Arizona will go through this process where they will really be able to be hands-on in that process of making decisions. And just a couple of kind of add-ons to that, what's powerful to us in that process is that it's an amazing tool for students to build their agency and their civic skills. So their awareness of how this kind of process works, their ability to engage and develop that confidence and communication to be able to do that with others. And then through the voting process, they also get exposed to what the voting process looks like. So that mirrors a real election. If they're interested, they can register for the next, and eligible can register for the next election. So we've had 5,000 new voters for Arizona get registered. So it's this great tool for students, but also for school leaders and school communities to really build trust and communication and to be responsive, to student needs. I think PB is just a really powerful mechanism for creating that kind of communication and the opportunity to solve problems in a way that students are truly at the table. Like Isabel was saying, they're not just being consulted or sort of asked what they think, they're hands-on a part of those solutions. So here in Arizona, it's really taken off, I think, as a powerful model that others are hopefully going to continue to pick up.
Great. And how, with that process, how do the schools make this process as inclusive as possible? Making sure that we're reaching the students or the community members that are often the hardest to reach.
I can say for Arizona, one specific example, and I'd love to hear it from Isabel because I know she's done so much work in this space too. Something that's been really powerful for us about school PB as a model is that it really is inherently designed to reach students who often aren't otherwise engaged in this type of leadership role or decision-making process. So by virtue of being campus-wide, of students being at the center of the process, it already is designed to do that. But we've been able to take a more inclusive lens. As one example, we're partnering with Arizona State University with the Participatory Governance Initiative on a focus on inclusion of students with disabilities in the process, to really focus in and say, are we making sure that students with disabilities are invited into the steering committee, that they're out there co-presenting on the ideas, that they're campaigning for their ideas, that they're leading these vote days. And from that, we've really learned alongside our school staff and partners some practices to make sure if you're designing a PB process, how to do it so it's representative of the student population, making sure you have partners and colleagues across the staff at a school community who can help you build those relationships. And then throughout the process with things like a primary vote or deliberating in the classrooms about the ideas, there are ways to go deeper to make sure that every student on that campus is truly given an opportunity to kind of weigh in. So for us in the student setting, we've developed with our partners some tools and practices for how to make sure that inclusion and equity are really at the center of it.
Can I chime in too into that, if that's okay? So in Phoenix, for instance, in Phoenix Union High School District, there's also like a committee we call a district steering committee, and their task is to really to represent each of the schools, but also come up with like some equity targets. Who's important, whose perspective is important to engage here. When they develop, when they have a list of proposals, of ideas, they score all of those proposals based on need as determined by the community. Does this idea meet a need that we heard? Impact on equity specifically, and feasibility. And so they go through all of those ideas and they give them a score. So it's just built into the process. And then for Phoenix Union High School District specifically, they have they're engaging their students, their staff and their parents and guardians. And so that allows for a range of voices to go into this accountability and spending.
I think that is a really great example and transition to think about like data usage, right? So you have a way to rank these by need. What is the possibility of using data, including this school level spending data, in a process like participatory budgeting?
I think it's really exciting, and something even hearing you all share more today is sparking a lot of thoughts for our work with school districts here in Arizona as one example of kind of this opportunity to talk about relief funds and this influx of resources for schools, and how do we make sure that students and community members are at the table in those decisions. We have actually had a school district partner in Tucson at Sunnyside Unified School District sign on to say we're going to use ESSER funds for our PB process. So they've started in previous years with a pilot to get PB off the ground. They're ready to really deepen that engagement, and the superintendent himself, is committed to coming to the training with students to say, here are these dollars. This is how they're allocated. This is what we're receiving as a district. Here are some of the decisions we've already made and why. And we need your ideas. And we need you to be a part of that process. So I think for us, we're starting to see those opportunities. We're pairing PB with educational opportunities for students and community to have more visibility into school spending decisions and resource allocation. It naturally as a strategy does that, because students, as they're building out their project proposals, are having to think about feasibility, budget parameters, where these dollars can go, can't go, and it serves as that learning tool naturally. I think adding this layer of where do resources go big picture and how do those decisions get made is a really powerful learning tool that students now get to be then a kind of a part of that conversation.
Do you have anything to add there, Isabel?
Yeah, I guess some anecdotal evidence of how this usually works out. All that learning that happens in all directions, not just for students. When using this kind of data in Phoenix Union High School District, I remember specifically when we're trying to identify what the needs were to begin with. And this was a safety process. So they were trying to repurpose a school budget that was previously used for school resource officers. There was a moment where the community members in the facilitated discussion asked if they could provide school spending data, basically. And we provided a graphic, and one thing that it surfaced was a really interesting conversation about, wow, the district actually spends a lot, for instance, on guidance counselors. And there was still an issue for students with guidance counselors, but seeing how much was spent on guidance counselors, I think led to a really fruitful discussion about maybe it's not the amount of money that we're spending. Maybe guidance counselors need more professional development for X, Y, and Z. And the same thing we saw with that graphic on how much was being spent in school. People didn't know that there were resources or even a school for, or not school, an office with Native American advisors. And so knowledge of what is already being, how we're already spending the money, allows both everyone, the school community, students, staff, and parents and guardians, as they're working with school administrators and procurement folks, to really identify what to spend the money on. And the same we saw with school bathroom conversations, here's how much is being spent on facilities. But then it led to a conversation about, well, if bathrooms don't feel safe, here are some concrete reasons and things that we think would help increase safety. And so having the information of what's already being spent is a conversation that I don't think would have ever been had, and that all of those learnings would have never been uncovered had we not had the school spending data and everyone there, the opportunity to have everyone communicating about it.
Absolutely. Oh, great. And I'm going to ask a final question because I'm already seeing some great questions popping in the chat, and I want to make sure we can get to them. Christy, you already mentioned, how a district is using ESSER funds in this process. So given this moment, around ARPA, do you see participatory budgeting informing the use of these federal funds? And where else is this being done?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's just a huge opportunity to think about scale and expansion of school participatory budgeting as the strategy. It's been such a powerful vehicle, both for student agency and civic engagement, but exactly what Isabel was describing, it, the way that trust and communication opens up across a school community to actually solve problems, whether it's with dollars or other strategies. It sets the table where there's an authentic sharing of decision making, and everyone's seen as kind of equal stakeholders in that school community. So for us, we're really looking for opportunities, with current school districts to think about these resources and how PB becomes a tool for student voice and for community voice and how to spend those dollars. We're thinking about how do we raise awareness for school leaders, whether it's principals or administrators or districts who are interested to say, we need more community input and voice in how we make these decisions. And PB is just such a well-built tool to really bring that into practice. So we see it as a huge opportunity to make sure that this as a practice really embeds student voice and creates more of that truly kind of participatory connected school community and climate and culture, which is the long-term piece of this, right? Is that you're building out school communities and culture around inclusion and equity and truly democratic processes. So it's a great opportunity to make sure that this continues to be more widely adopted.
Okay, that was such a great example. I'm going to go to a question that I saw in the chat from Christy Miller, who asked, how do you avoid turning school communities against one another when there's only so much money to go around? So I'll let either of you take that.
Sure, I think that's an excellent question. I think probably geared for the overall kind of data advocacy and transparency effort. I think in our work with PB in Arizona, what's been interesting is it's been able to be kind of tailored to each district strategy and objectives and community, which is part of what's so powerful about PB as a practice, is that it really can be modeled and designed to fit a given school community's needs and objectives. So for us, that's been part of the message, is that school communities and districts are learning from one another of what's worked or what's been challenging or how they might model their own process, but they've really been designing it from the ground up around their own community context and kind of what their objectives and needs are. So we've been able to really bring that kind of conversation to each community in that way. But I think that's an excellent question in terms of the overall advocacy around school spending and where dollars get spent, of how we build up a community of partners in support of the same kind of shared purpose, and using data as a tool, to have that conversation and to serve as fuel in that conversation, I think is really critical to our work as well.
Yeah, I agree with that. And the facilitation, the design of the process. In Phoenix, that comes up because they had a district-wide process. And so it led to interesting conversations about what it means for equity with schools that are smaller or in a different area. And so those are very much a part of the discussions in the steering committee, when we would prioritize the ideas and decide how many should go on the ballot. And then I will also say, in Rhode Island, they are using ARPA funds for PB. I think their process is $100,000. And this is the first time that the school district has really gotten this kind of investment. It's a very low income area. And so it is a very interesting opportunity as these funds become available, actually, to have those conversations. When was the last time the school district got investment? And for what? And how much was it short? How much did it fall short? And what we're able to do now, for instance, we should document that. To really have these conversations where we're not pitting people against each other or schools against each other. It's really, resources should be available everywhere. How can we all get here?
Great. I can't thank you enough for sharing what you shared today. We can have this discussion and it could last like all day, but I really want to take the next opportunity in our next activity for our audience here to really take what they heard and think about their own context. So with that being said, we were going to break into smaller groups, but for the sake of time, I think we can have this discussion full group. And think about your own state or district and what it would be like to design a process, for leaders in your community to do meaningful engagement, meaningful community engagement. What examples would you take from our discussion today? And how would you structure that process? So you could drop your ideas in the chat. And also, if you have more questions for Christy or Isabel today, you can also drop that in to our chat.
I've got a question then. So the question in the chat about sort of how do you avoid schools sort of clashing for resources and these kinds of processes makes me wonder about other barriers that you've seen that it might be worth talking about, in particular in places that want to do PB, right? What are some of the barriers that you've still seen to implementation?
I can share a couple of thoughts, and Isabel would love to hear yours too. I mean, I think, a couple of things come to mind in terms of barriers and then ingredients for success, right? I think the buy-in from the start, part of what's powerful about PB as a tool is it inherently involves buy-in because of the handover of control through dollars. So I think that part of the process is really critical, getting that buy-in of making sure that the budget is there and that there's authentic readiness from administrators and school staff, from everyone involved, to be alongside that process with students. That students are prepared and that they're ready to drive that decision making. And sometimes there are bumps in that process. It might be that student ideas don't track with what's feasible, or that there are some conflicts over what administrators feel like is the best use of dollars relative to the kind of winning proposals, or that there's already plans or resource allocation underway that students don't have visibility into in terms of what they're interested in. Those kinds of challenges along the way are a healthy part of the process. So for school leaders and district administrators to be ready for that and bought in to that being a part of the process of that, building that trust and communication is really critical along the way, I think is one of the key ingredients. And it can be a barrier, I think, if that's not really there from the start, or something to continue to work on, which we've seen as districts have gone on in the process and need to kind of increase that buy-in, among various stakeholders involved in the process. But I'm curious Isabel's thoughts on that too.
Yeah, can you unmute yourself?
Sorry about that. Yeah, in terms of, there's so many hurdles that can come up. I would say dedicating, like, there's a budget for the allocation, how to decide it, but there's also an implementation budget. And I would say the staffing, making sure that you're resourcing your team appropriate, it's hard to have these conversations. You need to do a lot of engagement, a lot of outreach. So I'd say making sure that the people that hold the relationships are managing that relationship, and you have good facilitators that can navigate these difficult conversations, because it's messy. It's not clean cut when you talk about budget and resources. So I'd say, like, that's something that comes up. Logistics, figuring out how everyone can meaningfully contribute to this process and everyone is available. Also, I think last year what we experienced being largely virtual, community engagement virtually had to be kind of redesigned. So those are some of the challenges that I've seen recently come up.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I think that's exactly in our experience with the student aspect of making sure, the whole design of this, right, is to build that trust and communication and agency for students. So really being prepared to be alongside that journey, and to make sure that if there are those barriers to project implementation, or there is an unforeseen challenge, or inability to kind of see through that, the importance of having that communication with students along the way, so that they feel truly engaged in the process, I think is really key. And that can be, kind of a culture shift and a culture change in some environments. And so it's a really great strategy to build that culture, but that can come with challenges, along the way as people adjust to that. So I think we've seen that really clearly. I wanted to shout out also Madison Rock, who is in the chat, including some resources there on PBP and the work here in Arizona. And she's just an amazing leader in this work too, and has also included a couple of toolkits from PBP on the school model. And then the work that I mentioned that we did on inclusion, in particular of students with disabilities, we created a toolkit with some of the best practices that we learned through that process for how you design a steering committee, how you get students more authentically engaged in the process. So we're always happy to share out kind of some of those learnings. And then for anyone interested in maybe bringing that model to a school community, we're always happy to chat too about what that looks like, what's worked well, like how you get the process started and how you find that buy-in early on.
Great. Thank you so much. I think, I can't thank you enough for everything that you shared. And, I think to sum everything that we discussed today, it's really important for us to tie things together and just say how advocating for how, we start with the data, right? We can advocate for how these data are calculated and reported. And then we could use this data to understand how funding is allocated and to help inform the participatory budgeting processes and the recommendations that we implement that are supposed to support students. And this is all part of an ongoing process that we all can play a part of. Students, advocates, parents, families, we're all part of that. And so I just thank you all for your time today. And, if you have additional questions, feel free to reach out to all of us, in our discussion today. Thank you and have a great day.